Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
We give a shit about our community, and sometimes you have to expand beyond the film universe and give a shit about a little bit more. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with once again. As always, my name is David Voigt, and I am the host of this podcast where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brains not only about current projects, state of the industry, what they've got going on, and all kind of fun stuff in between about the power and the importance of cinema, which is far too easily forgotten these days. And if you'd like to know more, and if you'd like to subscribe to our podcast, please feel free to follow us on either Apple or Spotify, and you can find all of our episodes archived over at YouTube. We'd really like it, too, if you followed us over on social media, over at In the Seats or at It's Podcast One on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for all sorts of fun updates. And finally, if you could come see us at intheseats.ca for all the latest and greatest movie news, reviews, and all sorts of stuff in between with our hardworking team, we'd really appreciate it. Today's episode is it's an important one because there have been film festivals going on virtually, and it's been a good thing. But this one is trying to make the world a little bit of a better place, and it's absolutely free too. So that's a beautiful thing, because it is the 9th annual Human Rights Film Festival, which starts this week, and it's what it's doing is it's going to run on all week, and it's going to have sort of these really fascinating films that you can check out about a wide-ranging variety of human rights issues, as well as a bunch of arts events and all sorts of, I'm getting a little tongue-tied, but I'm getting a little emotional. But it's about giving a shit, because it is a film and arts festival, and we give a shit about film and arts. And it takes a look at so many different things, and it's got all these different activities, and you've really got to check it out. I think it's an important thing. But we talk with director Gilad Cohen about sort of the origins of the festival, how he got it started from a pretty interesting day trip that he took, but I won't spoil it. Just the evolution of the festival, going digital, going free, and we talk a little bit about all the things that are offered at the Toronto Human Rights Film Festival, which is running from the 3rd till the 10th. And I implore you to check it out, because it's a good thing, and not just for film, but for the world in general. And I think maybe we need a little bit of that these days. So I hope you enjoy our talk, and I hope you check out the fest.
Now, obviously, just to kick it off, obviously it's the 9th year. Congratulations on yet another year. And I think, because I remember when the press release hit my inbox and it says, what does it mean to give a shit about the world? And that really, just this year, I think that speaks to me more than sort of anything else. But can you walk me through just sort of the origins of doing the Human Rights Watch, this festival?
Yeah, so the Human Rights Film Festival actually has, it's a bit of a different model. And I'll start this whole thing. I know that this is a podcast primarily in film. My background's not in film at all. My background is in international development. And years and years ago, 1,000 years ago, back in 2008, I took a day trip into North Korea. And it was one of the strangest trips of my life. I feel like we need a whole other podcast to get into the details of that. But the trip was really, really bizarre. And, when I left North Korea and went back into South Korea, where I was living at the time, I was teaching English. I went onto Google and I typed in, what the hell is North Korea? And what I learned absolutely horrified me. I learned that this was a country where most people, not most people, but nobody had access to the internet. It was illegal and impossible to make an international phone call. You needed a visa to just be able to travel to the next city. And I also learned that millions of people there had starved to death from a famine since the 90s. But I think what struck me the most actually about that experience, and I'm saying this as a Jewish person, was I learned that there were concentration camps in North Korea that were detaining hundreds of thousands of people. And so as a person who has family who barely survived the Holocaust, and in some instances, family members who didn't survive the Holocaust, it really hit me. And so I became obsessed with North Korea. I started working with North Korean refugees in South Korea and in Toronto. I took on a bit of an international development job. And despite all the successes that came with that work, I had a very tough time convincing my family to care about it as much as I did. I just couldn't click with them. They just didn't get why I was doing this work. And so no book, no article, nothing I threw at them worked. And one day I was at my mom's house and we sat down and watched a film on North Korea together. And when the film ended, she broke down in tears. And it was in that eureka moment where I realized film was able to do the one thing that nothing else could, and that was break through to my mom. And so I thought, what would happen if I could pack a room full of people and try to recreate that experience that I had with my mom, but with more people. And so in 2012, we launched what was back then the North Korean Human Rights Film Festival. It has since evolved. In 2014, it became the Human Rights Film Festival. Eventually you run out of North Korean human rights documentary to screen. It's not let's say it's not a genre of its own. It's not like it has its own
bit of a narrow subgenre. Yeah.
It's not like the Oscars has its own North Korean human rights category. And so we pivoted and we started focusing on human rights issues from all across the world. And so that's where we're at now.
Now, I mean, obviously in years past you've been in theaters, but I mean, obviously this year you're going digital, and plus this year you're entirely free. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the pivot that you've had to make? Because I can imagine, just from a timing standpoint, you were probably sort of in pre-planning stages right when everything just started to hit us.
Yeah, that was back in March, which was either 8 months or 8 years ago. I have a tough time figuring that out, but we actually pivoted right away. One of the things that we do at JAYU, the organization that hosts this Human Rights Film Festival, is we also do monthly screenings. So each month we present a film for free. And in March, we were 10 days away from having to do an in-person screening. And so we pivoted and just offered it online. We did this doc about a guy who was wrongfully incarcerated from New York. We were able to get him to join us for the Q&A. And dude, we had 980 people join us for the live Q&A.
Wow.
That's the largest audience we have ever had. The Hot Dog Cinema, where we typically do our festival, can't even seat 980 people. And so in that respect, pivoting to a virtual space has allowed us to expand outside of just butts and seats in Toronto and introduce wider audiences. But it's not all, rainbows and sunshine.
Well, of course, yeah.
Doing things online. That was in March. I think people were, excited. It's tough to say excited because it's a pandemic, but things were new. People weren't used to doing things online. And, right now we're sort of dealing with a bit of screen fatigue for sure.
Yeah.
So it's coming on with its own challenges, but we did think to ourselves, you know what, it's a human rights film festival. It's been a tough year for a lot of people. A lot of people have been financially struggling or struggling in other ways. We don't need cost to be another barrier for people to participate, especially when the dialogue is rooted in justice and human rights. And so we just threw the cost, the ticketed, the price or whatever out the window, and we've made it free. So everything at festival this year is free. And we're not just doing film, we're doing a whole bunch of other stuff, but I could get into that in a little bit.
No, for sure. And I mean, I'm always fascinated because, I mean, especially with a film festival like this, which has a certain focus, I don't want to say narrow focus, but a focus. When you're programming, like, do you see themes coming up in the work? Because, I mean, that's always kind of the thing that surprises me, because obviously there's going to be human rights issues across the world, but at the same time, you may see something that you want to focus on a little more, or something that's maybe playing out a little more sort of in the news on a day-to-day basis. Like, how do you sort of discern what to show and what not to?
Yeah, great question. And, we have a programming committee. There's 10 or 12 of us on that committee. We have a whole bunch of pre-programmers who sift through this stuff. Each year we get between 300 and 400 documentaries submitted. And, it's a human rights film festival. So it's a lot of triggering, very heavy content. And so sometimes you really have to take your time with this stuff. I will say, though, that the content that gets submitted is often reflective of what is happening in society. And so, for example, when the Syrian refugee crisis first hit, we got a ton of films around the Syrian refugee crisis. And so in that sense, we like to screen things that are topical, things that are relevant, but it's also a film festival. So we're looking for a few things that film festivals do typically look for. We're looking for artistic quality. We're looking for it to be relatively like modern or up to date. We want to be talking about something that's still sort of ongoing. But probably the most important thing is, how does this film that we're about to screen or considering screening, how does it lend itself to good conversation? Like, is there space to have a conversation and to dive deeper? So we never ever screen a film without having a Q&A after. And if we can't get the filmmaker or the subject of the doc, we'll reach out into the local community and find maybe someone who can relate to the subject matter. So if it's a film about a Syrian refugee crisis or the Syrian refugee crisis, we'll find a Syrian refugee from Toronto who can speak to it. So I would say that the themes tend to represent more what's happening in society, but we let the films tell us really what we're going to screen rather than dictating it with a theme, I would say.
For sure, because I mean, I look at something like Radio Silence, which is, I mean, this brilliant film, and it's harrowing because, you know, for years in at least the past year in North America, we've been laughing about it and joking about it, and it's been fodder on the late night shows. But no, this stuff actually happens in other countries, and it's terrifying.
100%. And, you know, I think what we hope too is that audiences can look at stories that are from faraway places. Like Radio Silence focuses on Mexico, but there are elements of what's happening in that film. And that film's about media censorship. Some of that is also happening, you know, with our neighbors down in the south in the United States. And so we do really encourage, you know, while this is happening in Mexico, we hope people that can see themselves in some way, or can see even like their local surroundings in some sort of ways. And there's media censorship here too. I mean, in Canada, there's stories that our media decides to share and others that they don't. And it's not as pervasive or sometimes as obvious as it is in Radio Silence, but it happens everywhere. Or not everywhere, but it happens in a lot of places here at home as well. No,
for sure. It's it's such a wide range of films that sort of brings up a lot of issues that I think, like you say, need to spark discussion, because, and I mean, it goes back to the tagline from the press release, like, I'm blanking on the line, but just in terms of how do you give a shit about the world? And that's kind of the point, because film will spark conversation. It will spark movement, even if it's small movement. I mean, it's like anything is a positive thing, especially when it comes down to some of these issues.
100,000%. And I'm happy that we're able to say the tagline here, give a shit. I actually
do it.
I have an interview tomorrow on a morning news show, and it's one of the first things I had to ask, am I allowed to say the tagline on your show? And they're like, at 7:20 in the morning, I don't think people are prepared to hear that word. But you know, when we were looking at the motto for festival this year, give a shit was the one thing that we sort of joked about it at first. Like, this is for people who give a shit. Like, who's this festival for? It's for people who care. But the more we said it, the more we felt, like you said earlier, that it is reflective of this sort of clusterfuck of a year we've had.
You definitely can't say that in the morning.
Yeah, 100%. And it's been a tough year. And, when I think about 2020, I do think about the pandemic first and foremost, for sure. I mean, how often does a pandemic happen in a lifetime? But I'm also reminded of George Floyd. I'm also reminded of Joyce Echaquan, that poor Indigenous woman who was treated so horribly in a hospital on the East Coast. I'm reminded of Devontae Miller and the injustice that he faced at the hand of the police just outside of here in Toronto. And you know what? These stories have fired us up at our organization. They've made the people that we work with angry. It's made us angry. And we've sort of said, you know what? Enough is enough. No more talking. It's time to do something. And we know who we want to talk to and who we want to speak with. And it's those who give a shit. It's for those who care about seeing the world as a more equitable place, a more just place, a place where people, regardless of their background, their skin color, their sexual orientation, their age, whatever it may be, are all viewed as equals. And that's what we're sort of trying to get at here with the give a shit motto.
Now, you hinted on this earlier, but how is the festival sort of going beyond just the core programming in terms of what it's offering up for people to take part in? Because I've got to imagine that the shift to the online realm and sort of the technology available has sort of opened the door for some pretty creative opportunities to happen.
100%. And so one of the things I was finding, we've been doing film for 8 years, and film is awesome. It's still easily one of my most favorite art forms. I take in so many films. I want to say every day, like I'm constantly watching film. But by only operating as a film festival, it's historically excluded other artists who also have very important things to add when it comes to human rights. Spoken word poets, even comedians. You sometimes see it, you know, when you're taking in comedy. I mean, Dave Chappelle gets a lot of flack, but a lot of what he's talking about is rooted in human rights and justice. And so you can use comedy as a tool to have those conversations. We have a ton of other art forms as well, like writers, and we're doing collaging and photography. And so by incorporating all of these art forms, you're not only giving space to, you know, connect with human rights in different ways, like through different art forms, but you're also giving this really great opportunity to artists from different backgrounds to throw in what giving a shit at the end of the day means to them, and why it's important to give a shit. And so that was really the point of the pivot there, was to just create more space across the board for more conversation.
How do you think sort of the performing arts in general move the conversation along? Because I mean, throughout the annals of time, storytelling in all its various forms has really been the way that we've not only learned, but sort of how we've advanced societally as well. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of big things, that issues that come up in a lot of the films and a lot of the talks and other things that you're having, but they aren't issues that get fixed in a day either. And I'm kind of curious, how important is it from your perspective just to not only have these stories out there, but to sort of at least give them sort of a platform and a push to go, you know what, there's this too. Maybe this will get you thinking, then you'll talk about that, and so on and so forth, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think a lot of times we ourselves don't even consider how much we lean on the arts to just get us through our day to day. Like what is it? Is it Tiger King? A film that has nothing to do with human rights, but it is a form of art that got a lot of people through at the beginning of the pandemic. And that's really what I love about the arts in general, is it has a space to sort of lift you away and take you somewhere else. It gives you the space to reimagine whatever world you want to see. I talked about North Korea earlier. North Korea is not necessarily a place that you can physically go to, at least some parts of North Korea, but through film or through poetry or through any other type of art form, you can sort of reimagine that experience in a different way. And in a way, go to that place that you physically can't go to. I always say, you know, you can't fix a problem if you don't even know what the problem is. And when I spoke about that example earlier in the in this interview about my mom, I mean, we couldn't even get her to start working on North Korea if she couldn't even figure out why to give a shit about North Korea.
Right.
And so I look at art as a tool, and a tool that we use, and I mean use in like literally the dirtiest way, like we use it.
Yeah.
We use the arts as a tool to get people's ears perked up, to get them interested, to start having a conversation. I mean, you can't fix anything without being aware. And so for us, the key here is to make people aware. And by bringing on really engaging, really creative types of art, I honestly think there's no better way to get people to care than through that entry point.
Was there a film for you that maybe, you know, back years ago when you were a young man, that sort of created that shift and made you more aware and more cognizant of a lot of the things that are going out there in the world?
You know what? I hope it's not too cliche or too obvious of an answer, but I as a Jewish person growing up, I just remember Schindler's List was that one film that my family actually tried to shield me away from. For years and years, they hid that film away from me. And I wasn't actually allowed to see it until I was a little bit older. And so obviously, you know, like when you're not allowed to do something, like press that button, you can't wait to press the button. But for me, being able to take in that film for the first time as a young man was really eye-opening for me. I mean, you know, obviously as a Jewish person, I knew about the Holocaust, but to be able to viscerally see it and the effects of it right there in person had a really deep effect on me. And I think if I have to think about my relationship to social justice in film, and you know what, I've done so many of these interviews in 9 years. That's the first time anyone's ever asked me that. That film may have been my entry point actually into more of a humanitarian or human rights lens on film. So I'd say that one.
Well, and you know what? I like that answer, because I mean, as much as before Schindler's, there had been documentaries or historical documents and this, that, or the other that obviously laid out all the facts and presented everything. Schindler really was sort of that first mass marketed media experience that allowed audiences to get sort of the emotional experience of it. And that's really, at least for me, what resonates with that film, because it's one of those movies that it happened, but you get the emotional experience of it, which is something that narrative film really helps to sort of convey that we don't always get in documentary film.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's interesting that I bring up that film because we, as a Human Rights Film Festival, we primarily only screen documentary. And I think the reason behind that is, with documentary, there's that real life subject.
For sure.
The focus of the film that people can connect with after. And that leads to a whole different world of conversation. And it makes what you just saw much more real, just because that person's now there live in the flesh.
No, absolutely right. I mean, documentary is such a vital form just to be able to sort of capture these things that are happening all across the world, and to sort of be able to put real faces to these things that are going on. And it's a unique marriage, especially between sort of documentary and narrative film, on how they can sort of both in their own way equally convey these important human rights issues that are out there in the world.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. It's a great take on it.
Now, I mean, at the end of the day, when you're putting something like this together and you're getting audiences in there, because, I mean, you can look at the bigger goals, you can look at sort of the hopes and the dreams down the line, but at the end of the day, after a movie is done, is your hope just to have people talking about it and talking about the issues at the end of it? Because I've got to imagine, at least from your perspective, that's got to be the one real sort of tenable goal that you can get by putting on something like this.
Yeah, it's, when I think of impact, obviously for me, there has to be some sort of change in human behavior. And change in human behavior can be as grand as taking, like for me, I think of it more grandly because I took a trip to North Korea and then bam, a huge festival started and all that. But it doesn't ever have to be that extreme or that large scale. Sometimes a change in human behavior could just be a conversation around the dinner table.
Yeah.
It could just be like when you hear someone say something maybe that's offensive or off-putting, because you've watched a film that tells you now that that's offensive or off-putting, you sort of call it out. It might also mean volunteering or donating your money to an organization that is working here locally on the ground to tackle some of the issues that the film talked about. One of the things that we do in our film festival too is we partner up with a bunch of community partners.
Right.
So most of our films have community partners, and what a community partner is, it's different from a co-presenter. A co-presenter is another festival that's presenting it with us. A community partner is that organization who's here on the ground. So for example, we're screening a film called Maddie the Model, which is about the world's first professional runway model who has Down syndrome. And it's a really eye-opening film just about the struggles that this young woman faces in trying to create this world of diversity and inclusion. So we're partnering up with two local organizations here in Toronto that provide help and services to folks who live with Down syndrome. And so that's a very small way to change human behaviors. You watch that film and then you're like, oh, who are these community partners? And maybe you go and volunteer with them, or maybe you donate. But we hope that something happens. And the smallest thing that could happen is you just walk away angry. I'll take that. If you're walking away angry, not at us, but at the state of the world in some way, and angry because equity doesn't exist for everybody, and that's a cold, hard fact, then that's good enough for me too.
And you know what? It's a reminder of the importance of community, especially in these days when we're all sort of stuck in our various apartments and houses, not being able to sort of be a part of a community. We still have to be conscious that we are still part of a community, even if we're just on Zoom like we are now.
100%, right? I mean, that's also one of the things I love about the arts is it has that really unique ability to build community. One of the things that we do at our organization is we have a program called the I Am program that we offer year round, and it's a arts and social justice training program that we offer to equity-seeking youth from across the GTA. Each year we work with about 300 youth. We teach them how to use cameras for photography or filmmaking, poetry or collaging as tools to share human rights stories. And when I think about, again, the pandemic, we're isolated, you're right. We're at home, we're not around community. We use these workshops year round to build community around these youth. So even though they're physically isolating, they're still coming together once a week with a group of other people, doing some creative stuff together, having really important conversations, but feeling like they're connected to something, maybe outside the four walls that they're sort of confined to at that moment.
Now, just to put a bow on this, if you had to talk to someone who doesn't know about your organization, doesn't know about the film festival, and then goes, "Hey, what's this?" What would you say? How do you sell it?
I would be like, dude, where you been? The more humble side of me would say JAYU is a charity that is committed to sharing human rights stories through the arts. And we use the arts because there is no better tool to share our stories and the human condition. And then I'd promote our Human Rights Film Festival, which is coming up from December 3rd to the 10th. It's 8 days of absolutely jam-packed programming that is free, that you can take in from the virtual of anywhere, your bedroom, your kitchen, the bathroom. You can walk around outside as long as you have a data connection. We have films, a spoken word poetry slam with a $1,000 cash prize, free workshops, panels, comedy, a keynote, a youth-led photography exhibition. And the best way to learn about it is to visit HRFF.ca or to go online. Get out from underneath that rock, go online and use the hashtag #GiveAShit and join the conversation.
And ladies and gentlemen, that is how you give a shit, just by joining in and taking part. And that's the important part. And I just want to say thanks for the time today, man. And I really appreciate this.
Yeah, this was one of the most fun interviews I've had. So David, thank you so much for having me. And
at the very least, because you got to say shit, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again for your time today.
Yeah, cheers, man.
Thank you.